In Kogi State, on 24,000 hectares of land, sits the largest industrial complex in sub-Saharan Africa. It has blast furnaces, rolling mills, a dedicated railway, a workforce of 3,000 people. It has never produced a commercial ton of steel. This is Ajaokuta, and its story is not simply a story about a failed factory. It is a story about what Nigeria decided and what that decision cost. Every industrial revolution in modern history has run on steel. The United States industrialized behind a wall of steel tariffs in the 19th century, protecting its foundries long enough to build the railroads, the bridges, and the machinery that made it the world's largest economy. The Soviet Union, after World War II, treated steel output as a national security metric. Steel tonnage wasn't just economics, it was power. China, in 2000, produced around 130 million tons of steel per year. By 2020, that number was over 1 billion. The infrastructure build-out that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty was, at its foundation, a steel story. Historically, steel capacity carried strategic implications far beyond commerce. Railways, pipelines, naval infrastructure, military equipment, energy systems all depended on industrial metal production. For much of the 20th century, serious states treated steel not merely as an industry but as national capability. In the decades after World War II, steel plants also became symbols of national modernity across the developing world. Countries that produced steel were seen as countries capable of building rather than merely importing. States attempting to move from consumption to industrial sovereignty. But the most instructive case for Nigeria is South Korea. In 1968, South Korea had no modern steel industry, none. It was a poor country recovering from war with limited capital and no domestic iron ore. The World Bank refused to fund the project, calling it economically unviable. The Korean government built POSCO, that's P-O-S-C-O anyway, a state-directed integrated steel company backed by Japanese reparation funds and run with near military discipline. By 1973, the Pohang plant was producing steel ahead of schedule. By the early 1980s, POSCO was one of the most efficient steel producers on earth, supplying the shipbuilding and automotive sectors that will define Korea's economic ascent. The point is simple. Steel is not just a commodity, it is a platform. Countries that control their steel supply can build ships, cars, machinery, and infrastructure at costs that countries importing steel cannot match. Steel is the difference between assembling and manufacturing, between consuming and producing. Nigeria understood this in the 1970s. That understanding produced a plan. The Civil War ended in 1970. The federal government, anxious to rebuild national cohesion and project a vision of modernity, began thinking seriously about industrialization. The timing seemed ideal. Oil revenues were rising fast. The import substitution framework, the idea that Nigeria should manufacture what it consumed rather than import indefinitely, was mainstream economic thinking at the time, and still was its anchor. Between 1960 and 1966, Nigerian leaders invited feasibility teams from the United States, Britain, Canada, and Germany to assess the prospects of a domestic steel industry. Most of them were skeptical. Too expensive, too complex. The domestic market was too shallow. The Soviets gave a different answer. In 1967, Soviet geological teams identified iron ore deposits of usable quality at Itakwe. In 1972, those deposits were confirmed to be substantial. In 1975, Nigeria and USSR's state firm, Tia Pro Mexport, signed a contract for an integrated steel plant with annual capacity of 1.3 million tons, designed to eventually scale to 5.2 million. The site chosen was Ajaokuta in present-day Kogi State, proximate to the ore and connected by a planned railway to the coast. Construction began formally in 1979 under President Shehu Shagari. By 1983, the plant was reportedly 84% complete, with some rolling mills already commissioned ahead of schedule. The ambition was coherent, the resources were available, the technology was in place, and everything stalled. The standard explanation is corruption, and corruption certainly happened. Reports from the US Embassy, cables and accounts from engineers involved in the project describe kickbacks beginning within months of construction, inflated contracts, diverted funds, politically motivated decisions. General Abacha, by some accounts, halted construction in 1994, not because the money had run out, but because he had already extracted what he needed from the project. But corruption alone does not explain Ajaokuta. Projects with significant corruption have still been completed in other countries. What made corruption fatal here was the specific environment it operated in. 3 structural requirements had to function simultaneously for an integrated blast furnace system to produce steel. The iron ore mine at Itakpe had to operate consistently. The railway connecting it to Ajaokuta had to function reliably, and the blast furnace itself had to run continuously because blast furnaces cannot simply be switched on and off. They require uninterrupted ore input to remain viable. None of those 3 conditions were ever consistently met. The mine was underdeveloped, the power supply, blast furnaces are extraordinarily energy intensive, was never properly secured, and the railway, originally contracted to Julius Berger in 1987 with a 5-year completion target, was only inaugurated in 2020, 33 years late. Even then, the plant still did not produce steel. That detail is worth sitting with. The railway was eventually completed. One of the 3 major blockers had been removed, and nothing changed. That is how deep the other failures ran. Here is the deeper question. Why were these fixable problems never fully fixed? The answer is oil. When oil prices were high, Nigeria could import steel cheaply with petrodollars. There was no immediate economic pressure to industrialize. When oil prices collapsed in 1986, and again in the late 1990s, there was no fiscal space to finish the investment. Oil made industrial urgency feel optional in the good years and impossible in the bad ones. While countries like China were building entire industrial ecosystems around steel production, Nigeria remained trapped between unfinished ambition and oil dependence. Every administration inherited the same political reality. Ajaokuta was often more useful as a perpetual promise than as a functioning steel plant. It could justify budgets, concessions, negotiations, and political announcements even while remaining idle. In 2004, management rights were handed to an Indian concessionaire under a deal that collapsed within 3 years amid accusations of asset stripping. Nigeria was later ordered through international arbitration to pay a settlement of roughly $495 million, nearly a third of the project's original construction budget, as a consequence of a failed revival attempt it had initiated itself. By 2015, estimates placed total expenditure on the project at over $8 billion. The original budget was $1.5 billion. A plant that was reportedly 98% complete in 1994 remained effectively idle 30 years later. Around Ajaokuta, entire communities had been built around the expectation of an industrial future. Housing estates, schools, technical training programs, and generations of workers emerged in anticipation of a steel economy that never fully arrived. For many families, the project did not fail all at once. It faded slowly, decade after decade into uncertainty. Most commentary on Ajaokuta stops at the waste. The $8 billion, the squandered ambition, the political farce. But the deeper cost was not simply what Nigeria spent, it was what Nigeria never built as a result. Here is a number that makes that failure human. Ajaokuta was designed to create roughly 500,000 jobs at full operation. Today, it employs only a fraction of that number, largely to maintain a plant that still produces no commercial steel. That gap is not just an economic statistic, it is the outline of an industrial class Nigeria never fully developed. Steel is not an end product, it is an input into construction, machinery, automotive manufacturing, shipbuilding, pipelines, industrial equipment, and infrastructure. Every sector that depends on steel in Nigeria has had to rely heavily on imports. And that dependency compounded over decades. Nigeria's steel demand today exceeds 10 million tons annually. Domestic production covers only a fraction of it. The country spends hundreds of millions of dollars each year importing iron and steel products directly, and significantly more once you include the machinery, vehicles, and industrial systems that depend on steel upstream. This creates a structural problem that goes far beyond a single import category. Nigeria cannot easily build a globally competitive manufacturing sector on predominantly imported industrial inputs. Input costs are too high. Forex exposure makes long-term planning unstable, and every major naira devaluation, of which there have been many, raises the cost of imported steel, which raises construction costs, infrastructure costs, manufacturing costs, and eventually the cost of almost everything built with them. The World Bank places Nigeria's manufacturing value added at roughly 13% of GDP. South Korea, by contrast, had crossed 25% by the end of the 1980s, supported in part by cheap domestic steel flowing into its shipyards, machinery plants, and automotive factories. Nigeria's underdeveloped steel sector is therefore not just one industrial failure among many. It is part of the explanation for why Nigeria's broader manufacturing base never fully scaled and why foreign exchange crisis hit Nigerian industry so disproportionately hard. Dangote said in 2025 that Ajaokuta itself cannot realistically be revived. He compared the idea to putting a Soviet-era car beside a modern Kia and expecting it to compete. His point was not entirely unreasonable. Much of the equipment was installed in the 1980s. Large portions have corroded, deteriorated, or become technologically obsolete. The blast furnace model Ajaokuta was designed around is itself gradually losing ground globally to electric arc furnaces and eventually hydrogen-based steelmaking technologies. So is he right? Probably. At least about Ajaokuta specifically. But the more important question is not whether Nigeria can save one Soviet-era steel complex. It is whether Nigeria intends to have a steel strategy at all. Here, the evidence becomes more nuanced. Integrated steelmaking through the traditional blast furnace route requires enormous and continuous capital, highly reliable power, sophisticated logistics, infrastructure, and deep technical coordination, conditions Nigeria still struggles to sustain consistently. China now produces more than half the world's steel output, often at commodity prices that few new entrants can realistically undercut. Competing directly at that scale is unlikely to be viable. The irony is difficult to miss. The country that made Nigerian steel independence hardest to justify economically is now the country being courted to help build it. In 2024, the Nigerian government opened discussions with Chinese firm Luan Steel Holding regarding Ajaokuta's future. That may ultimately prove to be the pragmatic path. But it would also mean that Nigeria's steel future, if it emerges at all, may be built on Chinese technology, Chinese financing, and Chinese industrial logic. That is a different kind of dependence from the one Ajaokuta was originally meant to escape. Mini mills, however, present a different calculation. Electric arc furnaces, which melt scrap steel rather than processing iron ore from scratch, are modular, faster to build, less capital intensive, and already operate at limited scale within Nigeria. The challenge is whether Nigeria can secure two things consistently: scrap supply and electricity. That electricity problem is not rhetorical. Even the more achievable version of a steel industry still depends on stable grid power, something Nigeria continues to struggle with fundamentally. Without that foundation, the country risks producing the same infrastructure trap that crippled Ajaokuta. What this points toward instead is a more sequenced industrial logic. Stabilize the grid, expand mini-mill capacity, and focus first on downstream steel products, construction rebar, pipes, structural sections where domestic demand already exists and import substitution is genuinely available or achievable. That is not the grand industrial vision imagined in the 1970s. It is not Ajaokuta. But it may be the difference between industrial strategy that could realistically work and another national promise that survives only as a rhetoric. Nigeria's steel story is ultimately a story about what happens when a country substitutes oil revenue for industrial discipline. The furnace at Ajaokuta was never truly lit, but the consequences of that failure spread far beyond one unfinished steel plant. They shaped the limits of Nigeria's industrial economy for half a century, and the cost is still being paid. I am Ajaokuta Steel for Nigerianomics. If you want analysis that goes beyond the headlines, subscribe, like, and share. I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for watching.